Many of us have experienced one-night stands, and more often than not, we've likely woken up with some regret. If nothing else, they can make for a pretty good story. What is your craziest one-night stand story? Welcome back to our channel. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Story 1. A few years ago, I went out to a bar in my hometown and ended up going home with a girl I had met there. Afterward, her brother and his wife offered to give us a ride back to her house, and I thought we'd all hang out and drink some more. But when we arrived, her brother and his wife just drove off, leaving me alone with her, which seemed a bit strange, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. As we stood on the front porch chatting, things took a sudden turn. She kissed me unexpectedly and very aggressively. Then, she grabbed my shirt and tore it open. I was caught off guard and said something like, "Hey, what's going on here?" She kissed me again, which left me a bit shaken. She brought me inside, and that's when I noticed men's work boots by the door. I asked her if she had a roommate, but she quickly got defensive and told me that her dad lived with her. She said that if he found out I was there, it could cause trouble for both of us. Despite the tense atmosphere, I still followed her to her room. However, things quickly became more intense than I was comfortable with, and I told her I wasn't really into that level of roughness. She seemed frustrated but didn't stop, and we moved into the bathroom. While things were happening there, I noticed a strong, unpleasant smell coming from the toilet. It was a bit overwhelming, and I knew I had to get out of there. I suggested we go back to her room to try again, but before we could continue, she suddenly paused and whispered that her dad was awake. I felt a little panicked, and she told me to wait while she got dressed. I started to feel increasingly uncomfortable, and after some time, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I even considered jumping out the window to escape, but she caught me in the act and got upset. After some back and forth, I decided to stay and wait, but as soon as she turned her back, I bolted for the door, ran through the house, and made my way out. I ended up at a friend's place, where I passed out on the couch and tried to shake off the entire weird experience. Looking back, it was a strange and uncomfortable night. I didn't know exactly what to make of it, and it definitely left me feeling confused about everything that had happened. Story 2. A friend of mine had an interesting encounter one night. We were out at a bar and ran into a group of older women. Two of them joined us at our table, and we started chatting and having drinks. One of them seemed to take a particular liking to our friend Steve. After a while, the group started to head home, as older women tend to have more responsibilities earlier in the evening. We got up for drinks, and when we returned, Steve and the woman were nowhere to be found. The others assumed she'd gone home, but we had a hunch about what might have happened. Steve later told us that they had gone to a quieter bar for some time before she took him to a taxi and back to her place. There, they spent the night together. The next morning, during breakfast, Steve noticed a picture of one of our other friends, Chris, on the wall. He asked the woman, "Do you know Chris?" She replied, "Well, I should. I'm his mother." She was both surprised and amused by the realization that she had just spent the night with one of her son's friends. A couple of days later, Chris joined us at the pub when Steve came over. Steve jokingly said, "Chris, I've got a confession. I met your mom last weekend." Chris, initially skeptical, started asking Steve more questions. When Steve provided more details, Chris couldn't believe it and loudly exclaimed, "You actually slept with my mom?" The entire pub overheard, and the bartender, with a smirk, handed Steve his drink and said, "Nice." Story 3. I went to a college party with 4 of my roommates. We lived in a suite-style dorm, with 3 rooms and 2 people per room, sharing a very small living room. While we were there, we got on the topic of names. My last name is a bit unusual. It's not pronounced the way it's spelled, with all the vowels jumbled up. One of the girls at the party got really fixated on it, saying it over and over, and we ended up chatting for a while. Eventually, I took her back to my place. At some point, my roommates came home, 2 of them with girls. Luckily, not my roommate. Things started to get, well, pretty intimate between the girl and I, but with 4 people in our suite and 2 more in the next room, it was loud. At one point, in the middle of everything, she suddenly yells out my full name, loudly. That's when I realized I didn't even know her name. We had spent the whole time talking about mine. So, in my drunken state, I did the only logical thing. I yelled out my own full name. And yes, I yelled my own name during, well, that. With an audience just outside the room and 2 people going at it next door. Everyone in the suite started laughing. The people next door also burst into laughter. The girl I was with, without missing a beat, very loudly screamed my full name again. I never heard the end of it for the rest of the semester. My friends started using my full name from then on. Luckily, the girl thought it was funny, and any time I saw her on campus, she'd flirtatiously greet me using my full name. Somehow, I became a bit of a legend, thanks to my roommates, who thought I had the confidence to yell my own name while doing it, when in reality, I was just a drunk idiot who forgot to learn the girl's name. Story 4. I was 21 at the time and I had never had a one-night stand before. Here's how it happened. I met a woman at a bar and things moved quickly. We ended up going back to her place. The next morning, I had to get up and head to work. I got dressed and made my way downstairs, walking through the kitchen to head out the back door we came in through the night before. As I reached for the handle, I happened to glance to the left and froze. There, sipping coffee, was a woman who turned out to be my third-grade teacher. I was mortified. I'm sure my face turned bright red. We locked eyes for a moment, and I just slowly backed out the door, trying to play it cool. Needless to say, I didn't have another one-night stand for a long time after that. Maybe more funny than crazy, but here we are. Story 5. When I was a freshman in college, I developed a strong crush on a senior girl. One day, I told a mutual friend, let's call him H, that I found her attractive. H agreed that she was good-looking and ended up giving me her contact information. Months passed, and nothing significant came of it. We exchanged a few messages, but they were all pretty casual. Then, one night, after a party, I was walking home a bit tipsy when the girl approached me while I was grabbing a late-night snack in the student union. She invited me back to her place, and I was honestly taken aback considering we had only talked a little. My surprise quickly gave way to excitement though. I figured H must have told her I liked her. Why else would she randomly invite me over? So, we headed back to her place, and while the experience was fine, it's not really the focus of the story. Afterward, she casually mentioned something that completely threw me off. She had just broken up with H only a few days ago. I had no idea. When H gave me her number, he had been in a relationship with her for months, and he never mentioned it. In fact, he had kept it a secret from most of his friends. So, in hindsight, I had unknowingly gotten involved with my close friend's ex just days after their breakup. It was a strange situation, especially since I had recently gotten out of a tough relationship myself. Still, it was a bit of a confidence boost, even if the whole thing was really awkward. Story 6. Back in 2005, I was a young climate activist managing a climate justice convergence center outside a UN conference. One day, I walk in and there's this incredibly attractive Costa Rican guy, super fit and intense, giving me some serious looks. After the climate march that weekend, we grab some pizza, and he offers to pay. I notice he has a fancy credit card, which surprises me because he doesn't seem like the kind of guy who'd have that kind of thing, given his radical activism vibe. I ask him about his family, and he casually mentions that his dad is a doctor. That night, we ended up spending time together, and I can honestly say he was an intense experience, definitely one of the most passionate moments I'd had. The next day, I got arrested, and spent a week in prison due to an old protest charge I wasn't even aware of, some political repression situation. I never saw him again. A couple of years later, I start dating another Costa Rican guy, and he asks if I've ever dated a Costa Rican before. I told him the story of the guy I met at the conference. He pauses, looks at me, and says, I think that was the son of the president of Costa Rica. I laughed and told him his dad was just a doctor. He replies, yeah, the president is a doctor. Story 7. I was in my early 30s, having recently gotten out of a difficult relationship. I started chatting with a girl on OkCupid who seemed really attractive and intelligent. She was a PhD candidate in philosophy at NYU. We decided to go to an art show and then head to a bar afterward. The art show had free wine, which was a nice bonus for me. But for her, the wine didn't quite meet her expectations. Once we got to the bar, she quickly ordered 3 shots of whiskey for each of us. After several more shots, I was feeling pretty intoxicated. Eventually, we decided to take a cab back to my place. At my place, things started to get physical, even though we were both pretty drunk. She was very forward and took the lead. At one point, she accidentally hit me in the face. I didn't think much of it, but then it happened again, and it was a lot harder. It was enough to hurt, but thankfully, it wasn't serious. I was too drunk to react properly, so I didn't really do anything. A minute later, she seemed to tire out, rolled off me, and fell asleep almost immediately. She ended up sleeping for the next 11 hours, and when I woke her up because I needed to go to work, we never saw each other again. Story 8. I met a girl at a bar and we decided to leave together. Neither of us were in any condition to drive, so we ended up climbing some exterior stairs up to the top of a parking garage. She was leaning over the railing while we were going at it, when suddenly, a security guard walked out the doors below us. Dude looks up and asks, y'all offing yourself or just having s-? Just I said. He says alright, be careful, and just walks away clapping. Story 9. I lost my V-card at a New Year's party when I was 20, spending the weekend with my much older brother, who was 30 years older than me. He decided to go out, so he left me at a friend's house. There was a foreign exchange student from France staying with them, and after we all got a bit drunk, we ended up becoming intimate on the sofa. Someone else was sitting on the other sofa, though I'm not sure if they were paying attention. After that night, I never saw any of those people again. Story 10. I hooked up with Girl A at a party and had a great time. About a week later, I ended up hooking up with Girl B. The next morning, we went out for breakfast, and to my surprise, our server was Girl A. Turns out that Girl A and Girl B were friends, and, well, that's where the story ends, unfortunately. Story 11. One night, I met a girl at a club near the beach. After the club closed, we decided to head to the beach, where people typically hang out afterward. We started making out and engaging in some light PDA. We decided to take things further, but since we didn't have any rubber, we bought one from a street vendor who was selling drinks and other items. We found a quieter spot to be alone, and as things progressed, just as we were starting, she suddenly screamed out loud. At first, I thought I had accidentally hurt her, but then I noticed a shadow moving behind her. When we looked, we saw the man who had sold us the rubber. He was trying to steal her purse while we were distracted. He didn't succeed, thankfully. After that, we both decided to go our separate ways, as neither of us had a private place, and we didn't want to risk another outdoor experience. Story 12. It was just after I got kicked out of my house when I was 19. Word spread pretty quickly at school over the next few days, and most of my friends drifted away, giving me a lot of judgmental looks. I ended up couch surfing, staying with anyone who would let me crash for the night. After about 2 weeks, I had run out of places to stay and was sleeping in my car. Then, one night around 1:30 a.m., I got a text from this senior girl who was really beautiful. She was feeling lonely and wanted someone to talk to. We talked on the phone for about 15 minutes, and during the conversation, she suddenly realized she had mistaken me for someone else with the same first name. She started crying, venting about how tough things were for her, and then asked if there was anything she could do to help. I jokingly said I could really use a chocolate milk. She laughed and said she could make that happen. She gave me her address, and somehow I found it, thank you, 2000 cell phones, even without internet. I had to sneak into her house, and when I got to her room, she handed me the chocolate milk. As I was about to take a sip, she stood up and gave me a look I'll never forget. At that moment, my brain wasn't in charge anymore, and we ended up doing it. We laid there for a bit afterward, and she said I needed to leave before her parents woke up. I snuck out and went back to my car. We never spoke of that night to anyone, and I only saw her a few times around school before she graduated. I never got the chance to tell her that night probably helped me more than she could have known. So, Brittany, if you remember that night back in '07, thank you. And by the way, that chocolate milk was delicious. Story 13. During my time at university, I went home with a guy. In the heat of the moment, he tossed his t-shirt off, and it flew into what seemed like a random corner of the room. We were enjoying ourselves for a while when suddenly we both stopped because we smelled smoke. Being very drunk, it took a moment for us to realize what was happening, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something burst into flames. It turned out that he had thrown his t-shirt onto a lamp that had been on all night, and it was super hot. In his panic, he started yelling, which caused his 3 roommates to rush into the room. Meanwhile, I was standing there, a bit embarrassed, trying to protect my dignity. The fire was quickly put out, and everything seemed fine. I started to get dressed to leave because the moment was definitely ruined, and I wasn't feeling it anymore. He begged me to stay and pretend like nothing had happened while his roommates were still in the room. Quickly ran out of there as fast as I could. Now, I'm extra careful about where I throw my clothes. Story 14. This story isn't mine, but a guy I worked with at college was known as quite the ladies' man. I never saw him leave a bar alone. One night, he left with a girl who was dressed head to toe in pink. Pink shoes, pink pants, pink top, even a pink hat. The next day, he seemed a bit off, so I asked if he was okay. He told me that when he woke up at her place, everything was pink. The walls, the carpet, the sheets, literally everything. He had been too drunk the night before to really notice. But what really cracked me up was when she asked if he wanted something to help him hydrate before he left, and he said yes. She came back with a bottle of Snapple pink lemonade. Story 15. I went on a date and finally got the classic "wanna come up to my place?" I'd never been to her apartment before, so I was surprised when I got there. Not only was it a small studio, but she also had 8 cats living there. So, we were doing it while 8 cats were staring at us the whole time. When we started back shots, Mr. Lemon jumped on her back. The only reason why I know his name was because as he jumped on her back she said, Mr. Lemon, get off! You naughty boy! It was uncomfortable. Story 16. I started talking to a girl I initially found on Tinder. We didn't really hit it off at first, but we kept chatting every now and then for a few weeks. She seemed open to hanging out, but mentioned she couldn't meet up past 11 p.m. for some reason. One night after my pizza delivery shift, she sent me a snap, and it was a pretty unexpected one. Curious, I asked if she was open to me coming over. I wasn't too sure if she would be, so I went to Waffle House to grab dinner and thought it would just fizzle out. But she messaged back with an address, so I decided to head out, despite being full from the Waffle House meal. I followed my GPS, but it took me to a rural property about half an hour away. She lived in a trailer on her family's land, so I parked my car out of sight and snuck onto the property while her parents were probably asleep. She guided me with the phone flashlight, and I felt like I was in a stealth mission. After some confusion with directions, I finally made it to her place. We spent a while chatting and hanging out, and it was definitely an unconventional night. Afterward, I put my work uniform back on and made my way back to civilization, my phone on the brink of dying. I stopped for breakfast at McDonald's and never heard from her again. Story 17. I had just gotten out of a long-term relationship that started in high school and lasted through university. My family and friends were encouraging me to enjoy being single for a while, since I had been in a relationship for so long. After a while, I matched with someone on Tinder. She seemed really interested, and we quickly arranged a first date. We went to dinner, and things escalated from there. I wasn't being as cautious as I should have been, but I did make sure to use protection once I gathered my thoughts. After the date, I didn't feel much of a spark, so I decided not to pursue anything further. 3 months later, I got a message from her saying that she was pregnant and was considering her options. The situation became emotionally intense, and I was overwhelmed by the news. Things became even more stressful when she started sending long messages about how I should be responsible. To make matters worse, I got really sick, and it turned out that my appendix ruptured. On top of the health issues, I was still in school with tons of student debt and no job. It was a really tough time for me. Eventually, I decided to reach out to a lawyer for advice, and I limited communication with her as much as possible. I also expressed that I wasn't sure if the child was mine. After a lot of back and forth, I took a paternity test after the child was born, and thankfully I was cleared of any paternal connection. Story 18. When I was 19, I went on a typical British lad's holiday to Zante. One night, I hit it off with a girl at a club, and we ended up going back to her hotel room. However, she shared the room with a close friend of hers, who happened to be gay. Things started to get a little heated, but out of nowhere, her friend barged into the room and, for some reason, didn't like me at all. He insisted that I leave immediately. So, we decided to take a bedsheet for some cover and moved out onto the balcony, which was about 3 or 4 stories up. After spending some time there, we tried to get back inside, but the door was locked. To make things even more complicated, we had to climb across to a neighboring balcony, still only covered by the bedsheet, and knock on the door of the room next door. Thankfully, the guys in that room, who were Scottish, were really friendly and just found the situation hilarious. They let us pass through their room so we could reach the front door of the girl's room, where she finally opened it, and I was able to grab my clothes and head out. As I walked off fully clothed, the gay roommate shouted at the top of his lungs after me, "You're a shite shag, you bellend." Story 19. I was traveling alone on an Amtrak train when a conductor came down the aisle and introduced himself. He was friendly but didn't say much else and walked away. A few hours later, he came back and mentioned that one of the sleeper cars wasn't being used and asked if I'd like to sleep there instead of my seat. I was young and wasn't really experienced with these kinds of situations, but I just thought he was being kind. He was handsome, so I agreed and followed him to the sleeper car. He was a gentleman and nothing felt forced. We spent some time talking, and there was definitely chemistry between us. Eventually, we ended up being intimate. Afterward, I fell asleep, and when I woke up a few hours later, I returned to my seat. A little while later, I found a tray with breakfast and a rose waiting for me, along with a note thanking me for a wonderful night. It was a sweet gesture, but I never saw him again after that. True story. Story 20. I met a woman online, and we hit it off, so she came over. We had a great time, spent the night together, and chatted for a while. I wasn't sure what her intentions were, but I enjoyed the experience and wondered if we could explore more of a mental connection, maybe even go on a few dates or see if we had the potential for something ongoing. That's when things took a strange turn. She didn't believe in advanced math. She had this unusual theory that anything beyond basic arithmetic was made up and didn't reflect reality. Algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus, all of it, in her view, was a fabrication. I asked her how she explained real-world applications of advanced math, like engineering, and she dismissed them outright, claiming they didn't exist. For instance, when I brought up bridge construction, she insisted that there was no math involved, just centuries of trial and error. According to her, engineers didn't use math to design things. They just made up numbers later to justify their work and get paid handsomely. At that point, I realized that, even if we were compatible in other ways, our differences in how we view the world were too big for me to overlook. Story 21. My best story involves a one-night stand, but it wasn't actually mine. I had a friend at university who looked somewhat like me, mainly because we both had long hair. One evening, I was sitting in the dining hall when a young woman came up to me, looking really concerned, and said, "We need to talk about last night." I racked my brain, trying to figure out what I had done the night before, and as I hesitated, it suddenly dawned on her that she had the wrong person. The look on her face was priceless. She was so embarrassed, and honestly, I felt bad for her, but I couldn't help but laugh. Story 22. I was traveling to Philadelphia from Kansas for a work meeting. Midway through the drive, my boss called and said the meeting was delayed, giving me a week off. Instead of driving back to Texas, I decided to continue to Philadelphia and explore for a bit. I checked into a hotel, had a couple of drinks, and went outside for a cigarette. There was a beautiful woman sitting outside doing the same, so I asked if I could join her. She was focused on her phone, so I tried to start a conversation by asking if she was from the area. It turns out she was Norwegian, visiting the States for training. We chatted for a while, exchanged Instagram handles, and before long, her coworker arrived, so I excused myself. Later that night, back in my room and quite drunk, she messaged me. I asked if she wanted to have breakfast the next morning, but she was leaving soon. Instead, she suggested we grab drinks. We went to a steakhouse near the hotel, had a few drinks, and then headed back. We'd been talking about The Office, which she had never seen, so I invited her to watch it together. It worked. 2 months later, I flew to Oslo to meet her again. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how I met my wife. Story 23. I matched with a cute guy on Tinder. I had recently moved from the US to Europe, and was in the process of getting to know men from different countries. He was from Latvia, so I was definitely interested. We met for drinks and chatted for a while, and it was clear he was a bit nervous. But after a few drinks, he leaned in and kissed the back of my head when I turned to look at something. I jokingly asked, "Are you going to kiss me properly at some point?" And of course he did. It was one of those moments where time seemed to freeze, everything just clicked. We couldn't stop kissing, pausing only to pay, take a taxi, and got to my place. That night, we were incredibly intimate, and it felt like we couldn't get enough of each other. We ended up being together for hours, and the next morning, we shared 2 more rounds. I offered to drive him home, and he accepted. It turns out, he was a bit nervous because I was only his second partner. He was 27. I was honored to be part of that experience. We had more chemistry than I expected, and I genuinely found him interesting. I mentioned that I'd like to see him again, and to my surprise, he texted me a few days later. We started seeing each other regularly. The next year, for Valentine's Day, he gave me a coffee mug that said, "You were supposed to be a one-night stand." We've now been together for over 4 years and are in the process of building a house together. Story 24. In 1996, when I was in my early 20s, I went on holiday abroad with a friend. On the first night, I met a girl who was about to leave the next day, and she was looking for a fun and memorable last night. We had an amazing time, said our goodbyes, and I thought I would never see her again. A month later, a few friends and I decided to go out to a nearby city we had visited a couple of times over the years. We walked into the first pub, and there she was. We started chatting and decided to meet up the following night for a proper date. The date went incredibly well, and we had a fantastic evening together, followed by an equally great, passionate night. Fast forward to today, and we've been together ever since, married for 22 years with 2 wonderful kids. Story 25. I was about to have a life-changing surgery in just 3 days and was feeling physically and mentally drained. Meanwhile, the neighbors, whom I'd never met, were throwing a huge party. The noise was unbearable, and all I wanted was some peace to rest. I decided to go over and kindly ask them to quiet down. Somehow, the whole situation took an unexpected turn, and I ended up having 3-way with 2 of the guys at the party. Let's just say I walked into surgery a few days later with hickeys that made me look like I was still in my teenage years. Story 26. I met a girl one night when we were both out with friends. We had some good conversations over the next few months, staying in touch here and there. One day, we realized we were both going to the same school party. She happened to know the owner of the club hosting it and got VIP tickets, offering me one if I agreed to spend some time with her before the event. I picked her up and we went back to my place. Things escalated quickly, and we had an intimate moment before heading to the party. We both ended up having a great time, enjoying the VIP treatment and free drink. The night turned into a whirlwind, and we spent hours hanging out, talking, and having fun. The next morning, after a very wild night, I dropped her off at home. We never spoke again, but a few years later, I ran into her again. She looked amazing as ever, and when she saw me, she gave me a playful wink before going on her way. It was an unforgettable experience. Story 27. I met a guy on Bumble who was seriously the most attractive person I had ever seen in real life. I thought it was going to be a quick, fun night. We spent some time together, and since it was late and we had a few drinks, he ended up staying over. The next morning, I woke up around 7 to 8 a.m., and he was still asleep, so I just let him rest while I started my usual routine. But then, he kept sleeping, until about 11:30 a.m. A bit unusual, but I didn't think much of it at first. When he woke up, he mentioned going to the gym, which seemed fine. Then, he asked me what I wanted for dinner later so he could buy groceries. I was a little confused since I hadn't planned for another night together, but I awkwardly said, "Surprise me," not really sure how to handle it. A few hours later, he returned with a bunch of groceries and started cooking me dinner, steak. Honestly, I was a bit caught off guard, but I couldn't complain about a hot guy cooking dinner in his boxers. It was just a strange vibe overall. While we ate, we chatted more, and I learned that he was living out of his car and showering at the gym. At that point, I realized he might have had other ideas, like moving in after just one night. I quickly came up with an excuse to avoid another sleepover and told him I'd text him, but I knew that I was going to block him. We said goodbye at the door, and as he left, he said, with a very sincere expression, "It was really great knowing you." I couldn't help but laugh, because he seemed to know it wasn't going any further. Story 28. This was my one and only one-night stand. I was in New York City. I met this girl, a gorgeous former Israeli soldier, through mutual friends. We instantly hit it off. I had tickets to the Global Citizen Festival in Central Park. Black Keys, Foo Fighters, Neil Young. She came with, and we had a great time. Afterward, we were walking to the train, and I went to say goodbye and she kissed me on the spot and said, "We are going back to my apartment," and bang. We made out the whole way back to her place on the train. She gave me one of the best BJs I've ever had, and actually told me my dong was beautiful, and we had sex twice that night. She was supposed to come to my place a few days later, but it got cancelled because of Hurricane Sandy and I had to leave New York. She ended up meeting a guy on a dating app a few months later, and now they are married and live in Texas. Story 29. Not my experience, but a friend of mine had one that still cracks me up. He had just gotten out of a serious relationship and was feeling pretty down about it. After a few weeks of being sad, he decided to go out with some friends to a bar. While there, he ran into a girl he had previously been involved with. They caught up, and before long, she invited him back to her place. They spent the night together, and he had a great time. The whole time, he didn't even think about his ex. Afterward, just as the night ended, she asked, "So, why did you and your ex break up?" He was caught off guard and all he could say was, "Bruh." It's still one of the funniest stories whenever it comes up. Story 30. I met this girl on Tinder and things were going pretty well. She invited me back to her place, and I agreed, but she warned me that she still lived with her mom. That didn't bother me since I was also living with my dad at the time due to the high cost of living on my own. When we arrived, we briefly met her mom, who was super nice and the type to bake brownies, and then went upstairs to hang out. We started playing a game, and one thing led to another. Before I knew it, we were getting more intimate. She kept going, and I was getting close to the edge. Just as things were escalating, we heard the door handle turn, and who could it be? Her mother, who's expecting to see us playing Uno or some shit but about to witness her daughter playing Hungry Hungry Hippos. My date quickly jumped up, startled, and turned toward the door. By that point, though, I had already reached my peak. She quickly pushed the door to, and spoke to her mum with it in her hair, dripping down while I frantically put my clothes on. Thankfully we weren't caught, at least I don't think, but it was a horror story of events. Story 31. New Year's Eve 2019 in Iceland. In the middle of nowhere, I crossed paths with a group of 5 friends traveling around the island from the US. The hotel we were staying at had a cozy common room with a fireplace and a large table. I was playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons with some friends when they came back from a hike and sat down on the sofas across the room. One of them kept looking over at our table. When I got up to grab a drink, I noticed that he was looking at me, not at the group. I decided to have a little fun with it. After we wrapped up our game, I walked past him and gave him a subtle signal to follow me. He did, and we ended up doing it in my room. There wasn't a word spoken between us. It was a great experience, one I hadn't expected, especially not in a quiet place like that. I never imagined something like this would happen outside a city setting. Story 32. One warm spring night, I was hanging out at my local bar when a guy I didn't recognize approached and asked if I had any weed. I said yes, and we started walking toward my place. Now, for anyone concerned, you might think, that's risky, don't go places with strangers. And you're absolutely right. But I'm 6 feet 0 inches in heels, and at the time, I weighed about 315 pounds. When I'm all put together, I can be cute, but I'm not exactly conventionally attractive. So, I've never felt like an ideal target for any harmful situations, which is why I've been more comfortable around men in the past. Anyway, the moment we stepped out of the bar, he turned to me and said, "I don't actually want weed. I just want you." I was honestly stunned. This guy was tall, muscular, and definitely good-looking, and here he was, expressing interest in me in a way I hadn't expected. We went back to my place where he followed through on his offer, and after a while, he left to rejoin his friends. I never saw him again. Story 33. A while ago, I was swiping on Tinder, feeling a little over the whole app scene and being especially picky. Then I came across this stunning woman. I swiped right immediately, and it was a match. I took a closer look at her profile and realized she looked familiar, but I couldn't quite place why. Deciding to be direct, I messaged her, "Hey, I feel like I know you from somewhere." She unmatched me right away, which stung a bit, especially since I hadn't been this interested in someone on Tinder for a while. Fast forward a week. I was managing a restaurant in Austin, Texas, and dealing with the chaos of post-quarantine staffing shortages. On this particular day, I had to fire one of my servers for inappropriate behavior. I was in a tough spot, so I called a friend, Mandy, who I'd previously turned down for shifts due to her availability. She agreed to come in, and about 5 minutes later, my host told me there was a call from a former employee wanting to pick up some shift. I thought this was a stroke of luck and answered the call. It turns out it was the same woman from Tinder. We both realized who the other person was, and it was a bit of an awkward but funny moment. The next day, she came in with Mandy to talk about the shifts and ended up staying for dinner. She was even more stunning in person, and we had an instant connection, but I had a strict no fraternizing with staff rule. Still, the chemistry was undeniable. As the night went on, I caught up with Mandy, and she confirmed that the attraction was mutual. Over the next few weeks, the flirting continued, and while I tried to keep it professional, I couldn't ignore the tension. One night, after a long shift, I found myself asking her out for drink. We went to our favorite bar, and the conversation flowed easily. Sparks flew, and before we knew it, we were kissing. The chemistry was overwhelming, and we ended up spending the night together. The next morning, I was feeling guilty for breaking my rule, but I really liked her. The following days were a blur of late-night texts and moments together, and eventually, we started spending every night together. A year later, we're living together, and our relationship has grown stronger than I ever imagined. It started with a one-night stand, but it turned into something incredible. I'm proud to say she's now my best friend, and I know I'm going to marry her. Story 34. I worked with this girl, and we went out for drinks a few times. One night, she suggested coming back to my place. After a brief moment of consideration, I agreed, and we headed back to my apartment. We spent the next few hours together, and by around 5 a.m., she got dressed and left. I went back to sleep. When I woke up, I went into the living room and found a note from her. It said she had a great time and suggested we grab lunch soon. Next to the note was a plastic bag. Curiously, I opened the bag and was shocked to find something in it. At first, I was completely confused, wondering why it was there. After some thought, I realized that before she left, she had an issue with the toilet. Apparently, it wouldn't flush, and she didn't have a toilet brush. She had tried to deal with it in a unique way, but unfortunately, she left the bag behind by mistake. It was a very awkward and strange situation, to say the least. After that, we never dated again, and she left the company a few months later. Story 35. Years ago, when I was backpacking across Western Europe, I was just outside Barcelona, hiking in the foothills of Mount Tibidabo. I was at the end of this path, and I came to a clearing, and there was a lake, very secluded, and there were tall trees all around. It was dead silent, gorgeous, and across the lake I saw a beautiful woman bathing herself, but she was crying. I hesitated, watching, struck by her beauty, and also by how her presence, the delicate curve of her back, the dark sweep of her hair, the graceful length of her limbs, even her tears, added to the majesty of my surroundings. I felt my own tears burning behind my eyes, not in sympathy, but in appreciation of such a perfect moment. She spied me before I could compose myself, but she didn't cry out. Instead, our eyes held, and she smiled, enigmatically, fresh tears still spilling down her cheeks. I was frozen. I knew nothing about this woman, and yet, as we stood on opposite sides of a pool of water, thousands of miles from my own home and everyone I had ever known, I felt the most intense connection. Not just to her but to the earth, the sky, the water between us, and also to the entirety of mankind. As if she symbolized thousands of years of the human condition. I wanted to go to her, to comfort her, to probe this feeling of belonging I had never encountered before. But I couldn't, because I knew that if I spoke, if she spoke, that moment would be ruined. And I knew I would need the memory of that moment to carry me through the inevitable dark patches throughout my life. And so, I watched her lower her hand, turn, and slowly walk to the shore opposite me. The rest of her perfect form was gradually revealed to me, and I held my breath as I watched her disappear behind a cope of trees near the water. I didn't follow her. In fact, I turned around. I knew there was nothing else we could experience together that would be more perfect than that moment, and it still remains the most profound experience of my life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.